So we will wait for a couple more minutes for people to get started, but I will just talk about a few things real quick. Wanted to give credit to Puppet. They're an automation tool, an automation company. They compile a report every year based on a survey they send out to their customers. A lot of the data that I'll be talking about today comes from their annual DevOps report. So I did want to acknowledge that and give them credit for compiling that. It's a great resource. I believe you can go find it on like puppet.com. I think there's a banner there where you can get it. If not, I can send out a link afterward if that's something that's of interest to you. Looks like there was a question about the recording. Yes, we do record these. We usually put them up on YouTube, on the StartOps group YouTube channel. We will try to send a link out to participants. If you registered through Eventbrite, you should be on that list to receive the recording afterward. If you have not, I will see if I can post it in the event page on LinkedIn as well, for anyone that didn't register via Eventbrite but came from the event page. Okay, I think everyone's had a chance to join now, so we're going to go ahead and get started. I'm sure there will be a few more joining later, but they can check out the recording if there's anything important that they miss. As I mentioned earlier, we're going to go through trends in DevOps in 2021, talk about what's new in DevOps. I want to say in the industry, but DevOps is not really an industry. It's more of a movement, as most of you probably know. So we'll be talking about what's new, what's changing, the kind of things that high-performing teams are doing. There's a big focus on what teams are doing that are successful at DevOps, and the types of things that you can take away that are actionable for you to also start doing, or things that you can start thinking about as you go through your DevOps journey, and sort of emulate the types of things that teams that are already successful in DevOps are doing to help you get there faster. It's always better to learn from others rather than trying to reinvent the wheel yourself. We'll also talk about one key thing, I think, today, which is how teams are organizing themselves and how they're coordinating internally within companies. It's more of kind of a management-focused thing. But I think it's really key to understanding how DevOps is evolving currently and the types of things that we're seeing at the StartOps group with clients who are successful in DevOps versus the ones that maybe aren't or are struggling with their transformation. So to get started, one of the key differentiators of high-performing teams is that they're doing deployments faster than ever before. Every year, deployments get faster, and high-performing teams are doing them faster than low-performing teams. This is just, it's kind of obvious in hindsight, right? But it's not something that maybe everyone thinks about right away. But teams that are able to deploy faster with a low change failure rate, obviously are operating a lot more efficiently than teams that take a long time to make changes, have high change failure rates, where we talk about like MTTR, mean time to release, in DevOps sometimes, and how long essentially it takes to get a change from a developer into production and what that looks like. Ideally, you want your deployments to be going out to some kind of a dev or validation environment, getting tested, and then being deployed automatically to production if they're passing your tests. With as little human interaction in the mix as possible. Obviously, that's not always possible to fully automate, but the less sort of human interaction, the better. The less chance there is for human error. Obviously, the less time it takes for someone to have to be thinking about deployments and dealing with them and doing rollbacks and those types of things. So it's a goal to be working towards. That's what we would call a continuous delivery. It's kind of an old school concept in the DevOps world, but it is still a valuable one. But in the interim, focusing on faster deployments and less human involvement in deployments is important. And then making sure that deployments are on demand and led by developers is also key. So developers need to be able to do the deployments without a bunch of validations and checks and do them on demand when they're ready, versus like waiting for coordination from a bunch of different people and things like that. Team structure is really key. to understanding the dynamics there and how that can work in an organization that has like compliance issues or regulatory issues, those types of things. So we'll talk a little bit about team structure later and how that might play into making your deployments faster and those types of things. Another key insight from the report that I noticed that I thought was worth mentioning is high-performing teams tend to have a lot more organizational buy-in, particularly from the top. This probably seems obvious, but I see quite often some teams within an organization working on DevOps and doing quite well with it, and others are not. And that tends to create a drag across the whole organization because inter-team communication and changes across teams, those types of things take a lot longer because one team becomes a bottleneck. So having some kind of common buy-in from the top of an organization helps a lot. It's not that you can't do DevOps without that buy-in. You can. If you're in a team that's doing it, that's great. It's certainly better than not doing it at all. But if you can get that buy-in from the top, or if you are a leader in an organization, making it very clear that you're bought in and demonstrating that buy-in is super important. Less top-down buy-in equals a less efficient organization. Again, doesn't mean you can't do DevOps if you're an individual developer or a team that doesn't have a lot of management buy-in. It's just going to be a little bit more difficult, a little bit less efficient, slightly longer road to getting where you need to be overall. But you can still have a single team operating very efficiently by themselves and doing their best to kind of deal with the friction around them in an organization. That is something that happens in the real world because the real world isn't perfect all the time. So just keep that in mind. Don't get discouraged if you are on a team that doesn't have a lot of organizational buy-in. You can still do a lot within the DevOps paradigm on a single team. It's just better if you are able to get organizational buy-in. And sometimes part of your journey towards getting that organizational buy-in can be just demonstrating how you do things in a single team and sort of showing the top levels of the organization the way to do things, how you can operate more efficiently, those types of things. And that can be a way to get buy-in as well. So I call that kind of the bottom-up method of DevOps transformation versus top-down, which is more management-led. It still involves consensus and buy-in from the teams, but management is able to kind of create a common consensus and framework for the change, as opposed to the bottom-up sort of method where a team is demonstrating a better way to do things and trying to get buy-in by actually showing how things can be done better. All right, moving on to the third thing. This has been a source of debate in the DevOps world for a long time. If you're familiar with DevOps, you've probably heard the debate around, is DevOps a job title? Is it a team title? What does that look like? Based on the data, DevOps teams and DevOps engineers titles actually peaked a couple of years ago. Companies are not necessarily calling their DevOps teams anymore. And there's a couple reasons for this. More efficient organizations tend to break down the responsibilities of DevOps teams into cross-functional teams that work within functional teams in an organization. So rather than having a DevOps team, they may have embedded DevOps engineers in different teams throughout the organization. And they may not even be called DevOps engineers. There's, of course, site reliability engineers. There's cloud engineers, many other titles that could fit into that paradigm. But the important thing is that you don't have a team that's kind of siloed doing DevOps stuff. You have embedded DevOps capability within every team in the organization, and they're able to more closely address the needs of that team versus having a separate team that may not be as closely integrated or as aware and sensitive to the needs of the teams that they're serving. Overall, DevOps is still a philosophy. It's still a way of work, not a job title. Nothing against the job title itself. I think it has some value for other reasons besides just the practical implications of it. Obviously, it's, there's nothing wrong with having a DevOps engineer title or a DevOps team title. as long as you're aware of kind of the underlying, sort of culture and how to do things more efficiently within the organization, you can really call your team whatever you would like. The top blocker amongst low-performing DevOps teams or average-performing DevOps teams or organizations doing DevOps, I guess, was resistance to change. So this comes back to having that top-level management level buy-in. If the organization is resistant to change, all organizations are to some extent. That's what makes them stable operating organizazations. That tends to be the top blocker for teams that are trying to do things in a more DevOps way. High-performing teams did not have this problem, and we'll cover that in a few minutes. But the other things that teams mentioned that were blockers to kind of their DevOps transformation or their efficiency, legacy systems, shortage of DevOps skills. It's still a fairly new concept. It's still difficult to hire in the DevOps space. There's not as many DevOps engineers as there is demand. Other things mentioned are unclear goals, lack of automation. But surprisingly, those were like unclear goals and lack of automation were actually mentioned less than the skills shortage, resistance to change, and legacy systems. So those were actually the top three, which is kind of to be expected. What changed for high-performing teams is that they tended to be blocked by the skills shortage and lack of automation, whereas low-performing teams were blocked by that resistance to change. So that can be a huge drag across teams. Definitely there's a common denominator there where high-performing teams are blocked less by resistance to change. Probably they have that management buy-in or they're able to work around it more efficiently. Low-performing teams are dealing with that kind of overhead drag of resistance to change in an organization. So if you do want a fast DevOps transformation or you want to really get there very quickly, having that top-down buy-in is really, really key. So think about ways, if you don't have that buy-in yet, if you're able to influence that in your organization, make sure that you are thinking about ways to do that and how you can actually influence that buy-in and make for a faster transformation by having management buy-in. This doesn't mean that management crams changes down the throats of the teams that they're working with or forces the change on the teams, but it does mean that they help facilitate that transformation in a consensual way with the teams where you're getting consensus and buy-in from everybody involved. You're making sure that your changes work for everybody. You're still communicating in a DevOps manner, but you're just sort of removing a lot of the obstacles in normal organizations that organizations have towards change, towards making sort of sweeping changes across teams or for single teams, acquisition issues, those types of things. Having that high level buy-in is really, really, really important. Coming back to team structure, I mentioned this earlier a little bit, but it's worth mentioning again here. High-performing teams are cross-functional and self-contained. What this means is high-performing teams have all of the elements they need to be successful at performing their function within the team itself. They're not excessively reliant on outside teams. On a practical level, this means that each team really needs to have the capability to understand the security implications of what they're deploying. This doesn't mean you don't have security elsewhere in the organization. It just means that the team needs to understand how they fit into that and how to secure their own output or their own product. They need to have the DevOps capability embedded or available to them so that they can self-direct their own DevOps. That's also super important. You don't want DevOps being forced on them from the outside. It really needs to come from within. It needs to come from within in a way that works for them and the way they work. So that's also really key. If you have teams that are sort of trying to work within paradigms or with tools that are being pushed on them from the outside, that never works all that well. That was how DevOps was done, I think, years ago, where you kind of took the IT team and you turned it into a DevOps team, but nothing really changed organizationally. That's becoming a thing of the past. It still exists in some organizations, but high-performing teams are moving that sort of DevOps or IT or cloud function within the team itself, or if they have a separate team, they're making sure that they have individuals in the separate team tightly integrated with each team that's using their services to make sure that what they're doing is working. You can still have that common focus across DevOps, so you can make sure that your teams and your organization are aligned together. You don't want each team using different tools, different platforms, different things like that. And we'll talk about platforms in a little bit here. But basically allocating responsibility correctly is how you achieve this alignment. Each team is responsible for building, maintaining, and running their output, their product, their service, whatever it is. And they have all of the capabilities and skills that they need within the team in order to do that. This usually means teams are a little bit smaller, they're not huge. They have a well-defined scope of responsibility. They're working on a single service or product. If you're in a microservice type environment, it would be like an application or service. If you're working on more of a monolith, it could be one aspect of the product, things like that. But knowing who's responsible for what, having clear delineations of responsibility and allocating that correctly and effectively, and then making sure that each team has the resources and talent available to them that they need in order to carry out those tasks or those mandates or run their services effectively, those types of things. That's how you get really high performing teams, because there's no friction from the outside to hold them back. They're able to do things sort of on their own without waiting for outside input as efficiently as possible. Now, this gets tricky when you have regulations or compliance structures that require you to think about working within the larger organization and those types of things. And that's where sort of platforms and things like that come in, which we'll cover shortly. So internal platforms are a way to coordinate what's happening in DevOps within an organization. It doesn't replace the cultural, the process aspects, all those other things that we've talked about in DevOps are not replaced by having an internal platform, but an internal platform helps facilitate all of those things. This is kind of, I don't want to say a new phenomenon, but it's something that's become more common over the last few years and more widely accepted, I think, in the DevOps space. High performance organizations have internal platforms. The platform sometimes is maintained collaboratively by all of the teams across the organization. Sometimes it's maintained by a dedicated team. There's no right approach or wrong approach to this. It's somewhat a function of size. So we see in startups quite often the platform will be maintained by a dedicated, by a sort of cross-functional group of individuals within different teams, or maybe you only have one, sort of software team in a very small startup, in which case it's maintained by the team themselves. There are third-party vendors that you can use that have internal development platforms. You can build your own. The key thing is to sort of think about all the different parts of your development process and how you coordinate those together. So I can, if you have questions about specific platforms, I can recommend some. Feel free to get in touch with me after the webinar. I didn't want to recommend anything in the webinar itself in order to make it not too salesy, and it does kind of depend on your particular situation. So feel free to reach out. I'll have my email on the last slide of this webinar. You can reach out afterward. I'll be happy to talk to you about your situation and whether it makes sense for you to roll out any particular internal development platform, or whether you might build your own, or what that could look like, depending on kind of where your organization is in their DevOps transformation journey and the size of the organization, how you work, what you're working with. Those types of things. There's a lot of considerations that go into that. But this is the key takeaway here really is just that be aware of internal platforms and how you can start moving towards having internal platforms. It's definitely something that removes friction within the organization, allows you to make changes faster, but also make sure that compliance and regulatory stuff is complied with, that you're, sort of hitting the mark as far as that stuff goes. So that's something to keep in mind as you move toward DevOps. Having automation is key, but coordinating all of the automation together is even more powerful. And that's what platforms do. They allow you to take all those little pieces of automation, whether it's deployments or testing or code checks or compliance checks, all those types of things, integrate it into one platform where you can sort of see everything as a pipeline moving through your organization and visualize everything in one place. We talked about teams a little bit earlier. Making sure that your teams are aligned, particularly amongst different teams in the organization, is really important. This is something we see in high-performing teams. Again, they have better alignment amongst teams. There's a better understanding of who's responsible for what. There's a clear delineation of responsibilities. They share the same goals, but the way they go about those things could be different depending on the requirements of their particular mandates. Going back to platforms, they typically share common tools, common libraries, those types of things. This allows the organization to work more efficiently across everybody. So you don't have teams necessarily using their own tools and some other team is using different tools. That tends to cause issues down the road because things just don't work that well together. You'll have different data formats or different output formats, and the tools just don't work together all that well. So it's super important as you're thinking about team alignment, making sure that you're using the same tools, having common libraries, things like that is very important. In larger organizations, you may even have like an internal tools team. I know that's something that Netflix does, for example. There's a team that just works on internal tooling for developers. But again, they're sort of serving developers and teams by giving them tools to use. The individual teams themselves still have that cross-functional capability to actually use those tools effectively in a DevOps way. So it doesn't replace the need for DevOps or cloud or IT expertise, whatever you call it, within individual teams. They're still responsible for running and deploying their own software, but they're just being given a better way to do it that kind of works across the whole organization. It also helps if you're doing internal transfers across organizations, those types of things in a more enterprise setting, then you know that you'll be able to pick up the same tool set. And it can be a competitive advantage if you have a better internal tool set and your teams are all aligned on using that same tool set. So be thinking about how your tool set affects team alignment. Again, that internal platform, like we talked about in the last slide, really comes in here in helping to align everything, sort of visualize and show the flow of data, where things are going, what's happening within the organization, and making sure that it's all happening in an orchestrated fashion. All right, so we got about a dozen takeaways here that I'm talking about today. This is number 9. So there's just a few more left. Appreciate everyone hanging in here so far. I just wanted to remind everyone, there is a Q&A function here. Feel free to use that. I will be getting into that. I see some people have put in questions already. I'll be getting to those afterwards, so feel free to throw anything in there as we're going along, or as you think of it. Feel free to throw questions into the Q&A, and I will cover those afterward. Just a reminder for anyone who didn't hear that in the beginning. Something that I see in high performance teams, and that's borne out by the data that in the Puppet report that I mentioned earlier. DevOps is more than automation, but automation can be a catalyst for helping make those cultural shifts. But you want to make sure your focus is balanced. If you're focusing only on automation and not on process and not on culture, you're going to run into roadblocks because you're not going to be using the automation very effectively. On the flip side, if you're focusing only on culture or process and no automation, then you're just going to be talking. You're not going to be getting a whole lot done. So having a focus that is balanced between the automation, the culture, process, tools, those are all important parts of this, and you want to balance maybe not necessarily equally. Depending on where you are in your transformation, you may focus more on one or more on another. But overall, you want to make sure that you are addressing each of those points. And I think that the four that you should look at are the tools you're using, the automation, which can be part of tooling, but also has kind of its own set of things that come in beyond just tools, and then your culture and your process. So those four, you want to kind of think about those as you're going along. Maybe you focus more on tools initially, getting some tools in place, then you start automating things using those tools. Then you start thinking about how your processes play into using those tools and how you can improve process now that you have automation and tooling in place to support it. And you think more about culture as the fourth stage of your transformation around communication and team structure and sort of the way of working overall once the roadblocks of tools, automation, and process are in place. That's how I see things work out a lot in a lot of organizations that are just getting started. Sometimes some of those are flipped. Sometimes teams start more with culture and then they start implementing tools and automation to support that culture change. So there's no hard and fast sort of best way to do this. It really depends on your individual needs, where your team is at in their process, and all of those different factors that play into how you do things. Security is worth its own mention here. There's been a trend towards something called DevSecOps, or development security operations in the DevOps world. In my experience, and based on the data from the Puppet report that I mentioned earlier, it's really kind of a buzzword. It doesn't really change how things are done, but security does need to be part of each team's DNA or skill set. It needs to be tightly integrated into teams. High-performing teams tend to have security functions within each team versus having a single security team that is sitting kind of outside. It's a different part of the organization. Obviously, this doesn't mean that you don't have a separate security team. If you have compliance or regulatory requirements, those types of things, having a security team in charge of handling all of that can be really important because it can't necessarily be split across all the different teams. But all the different teams still need to have the expertise to understand security within the context of their responsibilities. And what this does mean is that dedicated security teams are becoming a little bit less common than they were before. Like I said, not going away completely, but we are seeing them being split up into individual teams. And if you have a good set of processes, and particularly a good platform that facilitates it, then you can actually enforce good security and standards across an organization without having a specific team doing so. You kind of let the tooling become the guide for your standards versus having like an external team, or I guess an internal team really enforcing that within the company. Instead, you move the security to the teams themselves, whether that's dedicated individuals or training and awareness for individuals that are already on the teams, or maybe training and awareness for the DevOps functions within those cross-functional teams. Whatever that looks like, it's kind of the decentralization of security and making sure that security is present at every step of the sort of software development lifecycle in the stack, versus security being kind of an afterthought thing that happens once something's been deployed to development. That tends to cause issues when redesigns are needed to meet security requirements, those types of things. I'm sure lots of you have seen situations before where an application gets deployed, there's a feature or some way that it's designed that is insecure. Security comes back and says, no, this can't be run in production. We need to make these changes. That goes back to the team. They have to fundamentally redesign something to make sure that they can meet those constraints. This plays into kind of the shift left philosophy, which is something else that gets talked about a lot in the DevOps world, where you move security functions and things that were traditionally done after development, you move them to the front of the process to make sure that everyone's working together from the very beginning of the development process to address those concerns. That way, when you have a product that's been developed or a piece of software, you're not surprised by the state of it or the requirements or constraints that security has, or even regulatory or compliance type restraints You're not surprised by those at the end of the process, and you don't have to go back and do that redesign because those constraints have been taken into account at the very beginning of the process. And this is coming back to sort of the focus and balance that I talked about. There's a couple of ways that you can try to scale your DevOps functions and DevOps process. One is to try to automate everything. That's probably the more traditional way to do things. The other is to have self-service, where essentially you're providing services. If you're a DevOps team or a platforms team, you're providing tools and services to developers that they can essentially do their own deployments, do their own changes, all those types of things, without really having too much involvement from external teams. So this comes back to the self-contained versus external split in that debate. There's a lot of overlap between these two. So automation plays into self-service. It's hard to have self-service if things are not highly automated. Typically what I see with teams is they start to automate some really critical bottlenecks first. If this is a DevOps person in a startup or a DevOps team in a larger organization, whatever that looks like, focusing on automation first can be helpful. Get that automation going, make sure that that's meeting some of your critical needs and eliminating some of the worst bottlenecks and such. And then once you've eliminated some of those bottlenecks, you can start to focus on externalizing that automation and making it available to developers within their process. And this could look like a DevOps team performing some of these functions, handling automation, and then making self-service tools or exposing, say, a vendor's platform to developers so that they can start to use it for their automation. Or this can look like something that comes from a cross-functional team where you already have some DevOps capabilities, and then there's some shared overlap between different DevOps capabilities on various teams within the organization, working together to have a common sort of way of doing things in the self-service platform and a set of tools that works for all the teams in the organization and can meet all of their needs. But typically that focus is split between automation and self-service to some extent. They're not mutually exclusive. Like I said, lots of overlap, but they are two different things to be thinking about how do we automate process in a sustainable way, and then also how do we scale by allowing developers to perform some of their own functions, or at least giving them access to be able to trigger certain types of automation that are critical to their daily needs, so they don't have to be asking someone else to do it. They're able to make configuration changes, those types of things on their own, without involving an external third party or an external team or something like that. All right, and the last takeaway here, as far as DevOps trends, there's a split in the DevOps world between high and low performing teams around how they talk about culture. The high performing teams tend to see culture as an everyday process. It's what they do every day. They have an action culture, a culture of doing things. Low performing teams talk a lot about culture, but it tends to be a stalling tactic. They're not actually getting a lot done on a day-to-day basis. They're spending a lot of time talking about culture without really doing much in the way of the actual actions to get there. So I really think culture tends to just equal the things you do every day. That is your culture. So to influence culture, just start doing things differently. That's the way I see high-performing teams handling the sort of the everyday sort of process of building a culture. Is you start doing things differently. You identify something that's problematic, you improve it, you do something differently, improve upon it, those types of things, versus spending a lot of time planning and talking about culture. It's really hard to influence culture by talking about it. You really have to just go do it. If you don't like your current culture, do things differently, pick up and start doing things the way you want them to actually be done. And you can certainly talk about the specifics of what that looks like, but just make sure that you're not talking about culture at the expense of actually doing culture in the everyday process that is, the DevOps way of working and the DevOps way of doing things. So I call this the action culture. It's just a bias towards doing things versus talking about them and then improving as you go along. So starting small, making incremental improvements versus trying to get it perfect on the first try, which requires a lot more planning and a lot more talking. And quite often you won't get it perfect on the first try anyway. So it's better to start with something that's good enough and then improve upon it incrementally as you hit the real world and you see the real world requirements for it, versus trying to work on it, just by talking about it, planning, and not actually, maybe getting all that much done as you're going along. All right, so that is the 12 takeaways that I wanted to talk about today as far as DevOps trends in 2021. There's a couple of key insights that I wanted to share here as we start to wrap things up. The number one thing is think about blockers for teams, and this plays into platform, self-service, automation, culture, all of those things. Really feed back to having blockers for team productivity. What's stopping your teams from doing the things that they need to be doing in order to successfully meet their objectives to deploy software faster, or whatever it is that they're trying to do? How do you remove those blockers? What are the blockers? Be thinking about those things, be focusing on removing those blockers for your teams. And if you do that, then all these other pieces will come into place, because you'll be looking at how is our cultural sort of communication and how are our processes blocking teams from doing what they need to do. What are the manual steps we're doing now that need to be automated? How can we allow developers to self-service these different aspects? All of that stuff plays into really team blockers or individual blockers for developers. If you can remove those, you'll be covering a lot of those other bases successfully. Second takeaway or key insight that I wanted to sort of share in summary here is allocation of responsibility and how that drives action. So if you're responsible for something, you tend to start taking actions towards meeting those goals, or performing the function that you need to do to make sure that you're handling that responsibility successfully. So having a very clear delineation of responsibility across teams is really key to getting the types of actions that you need, right? If teams are responsible for securing their applications, they're going to start thinking a lot more about security than if they're able to kind of pass that responsibility off to someone else. Same for deployments, for example. If a team is responsible for deploying their software, they're going to be thinking about that from the beginning of the design process instead of passing that off to somebody else. So think about the responsibility, where it's allocated, who's responsible for what, and then what kind of actions that will actually drive as you go along. Key insight number 3, platforms are the future, self-service is the future. This is really important. As I mentioned, it's not really a brand new concept, but it's really become more common and practical in the last couple of years as things have been more tightly integrated between various clouds and things like that. There's a tool called Terraform, very common in the DevOps world. Some of you may be familiar with it. That allows kind of self-service of infrastructure. When combined with like an internal platform or something, it can be very powerful in allowing teams to spin up their own infrastructure. You can have modules and reusable components in the cloud, things like that. So be thinking about how you can move towards that. It'll allow you to operate a lot faster. Your developers will be happier if they're able to self-service effectively. So be thinking about platforms and how you can allow self-service through a platform. It's definitely the future. It's the direction DevOps is going right now. You definitely want to start thinking about it now so you don't get left behind. If you're still using cloud without a platform and non-self-service, then you're just operating a little bit less efficiently than you could be. And finally, the fourth takeaway, we covered this, a couple different aspects of this, but really having top-down ownership of DevOps is ideal. If you're responsible for direction in an organization, you need to make sure that all management is bought into the DevOps ethos. They understand it, they understand the value of it, and they own the function of helping spread that to the rest of the organization. As I mentioned earlier, if you don't have top-down ownership in your organization of DevOps, it's not the end of the world. There are things you can still do, but it is ideal if you can. If you're in charge of an organization in any kind of executive capacity, making sure that your management understands DevOps and is bought into it is really important, and spending some time to make sure you have that buy-in is definitely time well spent. So that's it for key insights. I just had those four. Happy to talk about these more if you have any questions. There's a Q&A button in the Zoom bar here. Feel free to throw some questions in there, and I will be happy to answer them. If you have more specific questions that you want to talk about related to your organization or your situation, feel free to email me or hop on our website. You can contact us there. I'll be happy to talk more specifically about your exact situation as well. Really wanted to thank everyone for coming today. I'm going to jump into some questions now. We're getting a little low on time here, so I'll just check if we've got any questions, and then we'll go from there. People are asking about slides and the deck and whether it's available somewhere. This deck is not available, but this presentation or this webinar will be available. So I will, as I mentioned, this is being recorded. It will go on to the StartOps Group YouTube channel. So hop over there and subscribe if you have not already, and you'll see it pop up. There are also past webinars available on that channel. So you can go watch previous webinars if you'd like to. That's a great way to brush up on some other things I've talked about in the past. So, make sure you hop over there, have a look, subscribe, and you'll get notified when this webinar is available. If you did register for Eventbrite, we will send this out as a video link to YouTube to the registries on Eventbrite. If you came through LinkedIn, I'll try to post a link to the YouTube when that's available as well. So that's a couple of the questions that were asked were about slides in the deck. So as I mentioned, it's going to be available in video form, and that will get sent out. It'll be on LinkedIn, those types of things. Another question is around some examples of platforms and self-service tools. This is a great question. Unfortunately, it's really hard to answer in any kind of a useful fashion without understanding a little bit more about your situation. So tools, platforms, those types of things tend to be very specific to the size of your organization, where you're at as far as automation goes, what platforms or clouds or tools you're using currently. There's a lot of different options out there as far as platforms, a lot of homegrown solutions as well. A lot of teams end up building their own because it's just more tightly integrated and works better for their specific team. There's a great platform. It's a DevOps platform by Humanitech that's worth looking into. They tend to do a really good job with it, I think. There's one called Harness that's more common, probably a little bit older. That's a common one as well. So there's a lot of options. Like I said, feel free to reach out to me via email or via the website. I'll be happy to try to answer any specific questions you have. You can tell me a little bit more about your situation. I'll be happy to go ahead and try to address that more specifically, but that's kind of at the high level. That's the best answer I can give. I mentioned Terraform earlier as well. That's another great self-service tool that you can give to your developers to help manage cloud infrastructure. But again, without really knowing a bit more about your specific situation, platforms are kind of hard to address specifically. All right, final question. Any comments on DevSpace? I'm not actually sure what DevSpace is. Is that a tool or yeah, not sure or not aware of DevSpace, so can't address that one specifically. think that does it for questions. If you have anything else, feel free to email me. My email's on the screen there, or you can reach out via the website, and we'll get back to you as soon as we can. Thanks again, everyone, for coming today. Really means a lot that you took the time to spend. Really appreciate everyone's time. Hopefully this was informative, and we will be doing more webinars shortly. So keep an eye out on LinkedIn or on the blog for announcements of new events, webinars, those types of things. Hopefully you found this useful. Definitely feel free to give me any feedback as well on future topics you'd like to see or things that could be improved. My email is always open. So thanks again, everyone. I hope you have a great day, and I really appreciate everyone taking the time today.